Well, blessings to you on this Thursday as we come to you with your daily encouragement and have some more to read from Dietrich Bonhoeffer's Life Together on page 54. We were talking about a lot of times we like to have God enter into our life, but part of what we are called to do as Christians is enter into God's story so that we can get perspective on our story about how God can work with us, how God can rescue us. And this is a complete reversal of what we typically talk about when we talk about God walking near us. We are called to walk near God. And so he says this complete reversal occurs. It is not in our life that God's help and presence must still be proved, but rather God's presence and help have to been demonstrated for us in the life of Jesus Christ. It is, in fact, more important for us to know what God did to Israel, to his son Jesus Christ, than to seek what God intends to do for us today. The fact that Jesus died is more important than the fact that I shall die, and the fact that Jesus rose from the dead is the sole ground for the hope that I, too, shall be raised on the last day. Our salvation is external to ourselves. I find no salvation in my life history, but only in the history of Jesus Christ. Only he who allows himself to be found in Christ Jesus and in his incarnation, his cross, and his resurrection is with God and God with them. I brought this up because this has been very interesting in some of the critiques I've often had about how I've approached days and celebrations and things of that nature. Sometimes we are very sentimental in our church work. Everything from Mother's Day, we just had Grandparents' Day last Sunday. We also have interruptions that are political, such as our remembrance of the 21st anniversary of September 11th. We have the 4th of July. We have Labor Day. We have Memorial Day. And it's nothing that is wrong about any of these celebrations, except the priority in the Christian church should not be on those other days that are part of other stories, other agendas, but the priority needs to be on God's story and God's history, God's remembrance. And that's what I think is so interesting about our calendar, that we sometimes loathe, but many times I think we appreciate. I appreciate that I have more than a script to work with than just on Christmas and Easter. Sometimes the Christmas and Easter, though, seem to interrupt our normal, sometimes either celebrations or sometimes grieving. Or dare I say, our celebrations sometimes where we want to have them during Lent or Good Friday and seems like that. But the priority needs to be on God's story. And that's the point that Dietrich Bonhoeffer is making. And that's the point that we ought to make when it comes to our celebration, or sometimes might say our suspension of our celebration. To remind ourselves that we need to focus on living the life that Jesus lived. And that comes through entering into his story. Entering into the story when it might at times seem inconvenient. Entering into the story so that we too can experience what God did not only for Jesus but for the nation of Israel. And that's where we're invited to enter into the story of the liturgy and to put the priority on God's story before we put the priority on our story. And it's not a question of excluding, it's a question of priorities. The priority needs to be God's schedule, not ours. The priority needs to be God's story, not ours. That isn't to say God's story doesn't speak to us. It does. It speaks to us in very profound ways. But it needs to be a priority. It needs to be the focus. It needs to be the attention that we are drawn. Now, a few weeks ago, we had some interesting parallels between Labor Day and the Sunday that we were celebrating. But we did not, per se, as a congregation, celebrate Labor Day. Even last Sunday, while we had remembrances of the September 11th And we also had Remembrance of Grandparents' Day. We have that throughout the year with we honor fathers and mothers and other people that we hold as important. They come secondary to the story of Jesus Christ. They come secondary to us entering into that story, even during what we call the green or the ordinary time seasons. And I think that that is one way that we put and can put God first. Now, sometimes I can sound like a curmudgeon doing that. Sometimes people will say, why do we have to worry about that? It's not Christmas, is it? It's not Easter. I've had people say that. Sometimes people will rush into those celebrations of Christmas and Easter for the sake of everyone else is doing it. But we need to hold back on those days. We need to make sure that we get not just the Christmas story, but the pre-Christmas story of Advent. It's not so much that we miss Easter as much as we celebrate the preparation for Easter. Not so much celebrate, but enter into its emotion, its presence in our lives. And also, one of the things I'd like to highlight is the 50 days of Easter, which is totally missed by some parts of our church in our rush to get to it. We like to celebrate things before the event rather than after the event. And the church calendar provides us with that focus of making sure that we're not just rushing up and then when it happens to let it disappear. We need to be celebratory in the seasons of God's life, in the seasons of Jesus's walk. And what better way to do that than through our seasons of the church calendar? And it isn't that we get our emotions, our events, sometimes even our sadness, our celebrations all mixed up in there. We can highlight those things, but the main focus needs to be on Jesus' life. Because as he said, there is no salvation in our story. There's salvation, death on the cross, in Jesus' story. And Jesus' resurrection is the way that we can focus on our resurrection. And that, my friends, is a good news to us today. A good news that we can enter into Jesus' story anytime, and that we can experience both the difficult times and the important times, the beautiful times, and sometimes the hard to understand times. It's time for us to celebrate with Jesus in Jesus' story and let our story speak through his. God bless you today. We trust that these continue to be words of encouragement to you today. Take care. God bless. We'll see you tomorrow.